Hello, and welcome to our third edition of Who Knew? Today, resident Bob Kluel will interview resident Jack Frazer, a decorated Army combat helicopter pilot who subsequently spent 25 years as a special agent in the FBI, then 20 more years as an investigative manager for a major insurance giant. Jack will talk about specific FBI cases involving undercover work, use of informants and SWAT teams, plus an insurance investigation involving a human cannonball. I can't wait to hear about all of that. During this interview, if you have any questions for Jack, please call extension 6319. Jessica Corbett will be answering the phone and relaying your questions to me via text, and then Jack will answer the questions for us at the end of the interview. So, without further ado, let's commence with this very informative interview.
Thank you, Whitney. Before we begin, I'd like to start off with a news bulletin. For those of you who were not aware, today is the 250th anniversary of the birth of Ludwig van Beethoven. I suggest all of you, before you go to bed tonight, listen to some Beethoven. It will be uplifting and it will make your day. Something else that will make your day is our interviewee for today, good buddy Jack Frazer. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you to the December 20th edition of Who Knew? Before we start questioning Jack, I thought it'd be nice just to go over his background very quickly. Jack was born in Richmond in 1942 and was raised on his family's farm in Orange County, Virginia. He graduated from Orange County High School and went on to VMI, where he earned a bachelor's degree in history and also learned to fly fixed-wing aircraft. Upon graduation from VMI in 1965, Jack was commissioned in the United States Army, and he completed the Army's aviation school. He then served a one-year tour in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot and platoon leader in the 48th Assault Helicopter Company, which was a part of the 1st Aviation Brigade. He logged over 1,100 flying hours in that combat environment, which is a significant achievement. Following his service in Vietnam, he left the Army, the active Army. He stayed in the reserves in 1969 and worked for 2 years as a commercial pilot for Petroleum Helicopters International. That was in providing aerial support for oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico and the areas surrounding the Gulf of Mexico. On a flying mission for Petroleum Helicopter International, Jack encountered an FBI agent who encouraged him to apply to the Bureau to become an agent. Jack did so and was accepted and spent the next 25 years there as an agent and supervisory agent. He specialized in investigating violent crime and organized crime in the Midwest of the United States and on the East Coast. He spent 4 of those 25 years on the staff of the U.S. House of Representatives Appropriations Committee. Unusual. Throughout his career, he received 16 written commendations from FBI directors, including 4 from the man himself, J. Edgar Hoover. After retiring from the FBI in 1994, Jack accepted a position as investigative manager and claims administrator for the insurance giant AIG. There he managed the staff that was responsible for investigating insurance claims and suspected fraud. Jack retired from AIG in 2013 after nearly 20 years service there. Here at Westminster Canterbury, Jack is an accomplished writer of history and poetry and currently serves as chairman of the Parking and Transportations Committee, living in the Courtyard apartment with his wife, Susie. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Bob.
Right. Let's start off with flying, which was a big part of your career. It's played a major role in your life. What caused you to want to become a pilot in the first place?
Well, I grew up around airplanes and pilots. My father flew B-17s out of England during World War II. I had a cousin on a neighboring farm that was a fighter pilot in the Air Force and later a career captain with United Airlines. After the war, my dad came back to the farm and flew a private airplane, a Piper 140. It was quite a come down from a B-17 Flying Fortress, but it was still carrying out his aviation adventures, perhaps, in his later years. As you mentioned, I went to VMI. At that time, they had an ROTC flight program where cadets went to Roanoke, Woodrum Field in Roanoke, and we got 40 hours of flight instruction in light fixed-wing airplanes.
Right.
And from there, it was an entryway into the Army and the Army Flight School, which taught me to fly helicopters.
Right. Great. Okay. So it's carrying on a family tradition in a way.
Yes,
in a big way.
It gave us a lot of talking points when we were together.
Okay. After your distinguished service in Vietnam, you were a commercial pilot for Petroleum Helicopters International. That sounds pretty exotic, Petroleum Helicopters International. What was involved there?
Well, it wasn't 2 years. It was actually only 1 year. But I never intended to make the Army a career. And when I left service, jobs were pretty bleak, but the flying was a transferable asset for employment. Yeah. PHA was hiring, I applied, was accepted. They're based out of Louisiana, New Orleans and Lafayette. So I went to Lafayette, took the test, the flying protocols, and was hired and worked there a year. Basically, it involved piloting a flying taxi or a flying truck, hauling people and equipment out to the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, some of which were 50 miles or more offshore. The real challenge was back then there weren't any navigation aids, and the weather along the Gulf Coast is fairly dicey, so getting lost out over the Gulf was an occupational hazard that kept you on your toes. I worked 7 days on, 7 days off. That was a normal oil worker shift. Those folks were an eclectic group. They called themselves roughnecks, the ones out on the rigs, and that's what they were. And when you throw in deep sea divers, underwater welders, itinerant geologists, and a bunch of ex-Vietnam helicopter pilots, it made for a unique mixture, shall we say.
I would imagine.
One of the people that was a pilot for PHI when I was there was Chris Christopherson, the country music songwriter, recording star, and movie actor. In fact, one of his early songs, Me and Bobby McGee, was written while he was out on an oil rig. He wrote that sitting out there, must have been thinking about the road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, obviously, which he traveled consistently.
Were those oil rigs? They weren't anchored, but they weren't.
Well,
they were moving.
the production
moving
platforms
targets.
were anchored, but the drilling rigs moved very slowly by tug because if they drilled a hole and it came up empty under the water, it came up empty, they'd move on and drill another one. It's like drilling a well. If you don't find water, you move somewhere else.
Right.
So when you were flying, they would give you where the rig was at a particular point in time and where it's supposed to be at another point in time, and you had to plot a course to intercept it, which was tricky because of wave action, weather, winds, that type of thing. There were a number of times when you would fly out hoping to intersect the route of the item under tow, and you'd miss it, and you'd have to go back because you wouldn't have enough fuel to stay on station.
Wonderful.
And that always irritated your customers.
Wonderful. How did you come to work for the FBI?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, which was extremely generous, by the way, one day I had a mission to fly a FBI agent out of New Orleans. He was looking to serve a warrant on some fellow who had been unable to locate. The guy was working on a pipeline in a real remote, swampy area of Louisiana, and it was a basic out and back type mission. But he was an engaging fellow, and we started talking before the flight and afterwards. And I questioned him about his job, and he said, well, with your background, you might be a good candidate. So that piqued my interest, and I applied and fortunately was accepted.
Well, it seems like to me that the FBI is a law enforcement agency, and you're an aviator, and I don't quite see the match. How did that come about?
Well, traditionally, the FBI hired predominantly lawyers and accountants, but over time they moved away from that and started hiring people with more diverse backgrounds. And when I came in, that was part of the equation. So the military experience plus the flight credentials was sufficient for them to hire me. I'm not sure I get in now, but back then it was one of those things where they said, come on in.
Wonderful, wonderful. You worked for several FBI directors during your time at the agency, of whom J. Edgar Hoover was the most notorious. He is said to have kept close track of field operations and his agents. What can you tell us about your relationship with Mr. Hoover?
Well, I was there for 3 years under his administration. I only saw him twice in those 3 years. Both times were during the training school process. They took a picture of our class, and he came down and reviewed the troops and didn't say much. And then I ran into him with others as he was getting off an elevator in the Justice Department building where his office was located at that time. Back then, the Hoover Building on Pennsylvania Avenue and the Academy down in Quantico had not been built, so everything was uptown except for us going to Quantico for firearms practice. He did run a tight ship. The agents flouted the rules in the field at their own peril. I'll tell you one personal example. In the winter of 1972, I worked a kidnapping case that turned out to be a success. And in those days, when you had a success, you got a letter of commendation. If you screwed up, you got a letter of censure. In this instance, another agent and I got a letter of commendation. When you received the letter in your field office, they took a picture of the agent in charge giving you the letter. The day that the letter came in, I was dressed in a sport coat, slacks, and a striped colored shirt with a pretty loud tie. As my wife Susie would say, I was in my rough period, my used car salesman look. It was not perhaps the most appropriate attire. In fact, my boss suggested, and I'm putting that in quotes, that the next day I wear appropriate attire, a suit, white shirt, and a subdued tie. I did that, and we were photographed again. I have 2 photographs, consecutive days, of the agent in charge, the other agent, and myself in different outfits. I assume that the last one satisfied the fashion police at FBI headquarters because we never heard any more about it.
Right. Okay, can you give us, back to your flying and merging the flying and the FBI, can you give us an example of how your flying skill, how you came to use those in catching bad guys for the FBI?
Yes, it was when I was doing it, it was a part-time position. Flying was a part-time position because there weren't enough occasions where you really were doing it on a full-time position. It later grew into that, but the case I'm going to talk about happened in August of 1977, and it involved an escaped prisoner from Upper Michigan near Marquette, who, after his escape, broke into the summer home or cottage of Leo and Evelyn Van Tassel. Leo was a retired professor, age 70. Evelyn was 58. She was a traditional wife, homemaker, mother. The prisoner, convict, named Douglas Henry, tied Leo to a tree with a chain, kidnapped Evelyn, took their car and fled into Wisconsin. Our SWAT team, of which I was a member, was immediately called out, and we went up to northern Wisconsin and started checking out suspected sightings and looking for the stolen car, but really didn't have much luck. Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin in particular, is lightly populated and very rural, heavily wooded. So it was decided that an airplane was needed to control the situation, to provide radio relay, and to expand the search area after a couple of days. My observer and radio operator, an agent named Roger Davis, and I were flying one day, and he got word that there'd been a cabin break-in over near Wisconsin Rapids. We flew over there, landed, caught a ride to the scene with a local deputy sheriff, and there we found 3 people a mother, father, and their son, who owned a cabin outside of Wisconsin Rapids. They had come to the site or to their property and discovered Henry and Mrs. Van Tassel there. Henry was armed with a shotgun, got control of the situation, tied them up. Mrs. Van Tassel stayed somewhat removed during the process. He took money, I think about between $400 and $500, left the car he was in, took their pickup truck, and left. Before leaving, he told them, when the FBI shows up, tell them to kiss my ass. They'll know Evelyn will be all right if they leave me alone. We immediately put the word out about the stolen vehicle, the pickup truck that he had left in, and an alert. We continued to fly the rest of that day and into the next day. Late the second day, an alert police officer in Des Moines, Iowa, located the pickup in the parking lot of a hotel. Agents from that area and local police went to the hotel and found Henry and Mrs. Van Tassel. They were in the hotel's restaurant when they arrived. they discovered a loaded shotgun, a loaded rifle, and other weapons in their hotel room. Mrs. Van Tassel had suffered what was referred to in the psychiatric community as Stockholm Syndrome and had gone along with Henry for her own protection. She'd had opportunities to escape, but did not avail herself of those. In fact, when they were taking him away back to jail, she said he just wants to be free. She was very conflicted about what had happened during their time. The trial was held in Grand Rapids, Michigan later that year. I think it was December, and Roger and I went to testify. We didn't have to testify because one of the owner of the cabin that I referred to earlier was there, and he testified instead. But Ms. Van Tassel did testify and said that she had been raped multiple times during their time together and had been in fear for her safety or life throughout the ordeal. Yeah. The jury found him guilty in 38 minutes. They didn't even pause for lunch. Years later, I wondered what had happened in that case because, you know, when he had abducted her and tied her husband to the tree in northern Wisconsin, and she'd had opportunities to escape, I thought, wonder if they stayed together. So a couple of years ago, I Googled her name and found that they had stayed together. He had died at age 85 sometime before her. She died in 2017 at age 98. I want to read something because this was a national case because of what was in her obituary. It said, Evelyn had a long and eventful life. In 1977, she survived a one-week captivity by an escaped Marquette prison inmate, which thankfully ended by an FBI recovery effort. Moreover, Evelyn and Leo were friends of President and Mrs. Gerald Ford, and she was fortunate to count a Thanksgiving dinner at the White House as one of the highlights of her life. She'd been able to move on despite a really life-threatening, life-changing experience. She was a strong lady.
Great. Okay. How about, can you give us can you talk to us about the range of cases that you might have come up against the FBI? Some idea of the range of cases?
Well, when I started in Washington, during the training program, you have sort of a short apprentice period, and I was fortunate enough, I guess, to work on the bank robbery and fugitive squad in Washington, and then I was transferred to Kansas City for a year, and I worked the same type of cases there. And from there I went to Milwaukee, where I spent a good portion of my career. I started off for about the first 7 years there working what they call the major case squad, bank robberies, extortion, kidnappings, those types of things. In about 1977, there was a change in investigative emphasis, which happens periodically. The violent crime program was de-emphasized, and foreign counterintelligence and organized crime was emphasized. And I was arbitrarily transferred to an organized crime squad. We worked what they call the Midwest Mob, which consisted of the Italian Mafia in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Las Vegas. And I did that for 5 years. And at that point in 1982, the House Appropriations Committee advertised for an investigator. And I applied and was accepted for it. Spent 4 years there, spent 2 years at headquarters after that as an inspector. And then my last 5 years were back at Wisconsin as a supervisory agent in charge for the Western Federal District of Wisconsin. That was 44 counties and covered an area about the size of the state of Pennsylvania.
Right. Right. One of the most dangerous aspects of law enforcement is undercover work. It's where the agent assumes the role of the bad guy and infiltrates an illegal operation. What's the riskiest undercover operation you were ever a part of?
Well, I did a number of undercover operations. Basically, there are two types. You have short-term and long-term. The long-term are where you'll see in the movies a guy goes into organized crime, the mafia, and he becomes one of the group and lives with them and stays with them throughout the tenure of the case. The same is true in some of the spy scenarios. The short-term ones are all case specific. You get, they need to throw somebody into a situation quickly. They look around and say, Jack, you look like a longshore worker. We need you to go in and find out this or that. I did that. It was a horrible job. I didn't get the information that was needed, and I did a lot of hard work. It's not like James Bond where, you're out in exotic locations with beautiful women and drinking and eating in the best restaurants. I worked undercover on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation once. Back in 1973, the American Indian movement took over the village of Wounded Knee. It was a 71-day ordeal. After negotiations started to fail, the FBI became worried about the condition of the hostages. There were 11 people taken hostage. So they cut the power to the village, and they needed an electrician. And I got the short straw. So I was tutored by the local electric utility. They taught me how to climb a pole and pretend to look at a transformer. They gave me a hard hat, uniform. They even gave me their company truck. And I drove out and passed myself off as an electrician. And my wife has always said, how the hell could you pass yourself off as an electrician? You can't do anything around the house. I'm probably the least handy guy here at Westminster Canterbury, but for whatever reason it worked. But one that I should probably talk about in a little more detail involved working as a convict. And again, I refer to the unglamorous nature of some of the undercover jobs. I think it was 1980, there was a planned prison break at the Federal Correctional Institute at Oxford, Wisconsin. 3 inmates doing time for bank robbery, 1 for murder, were planning an escape, and they were looking for a helicopter pilot to fly into the grounds and lift them out. They had outside help from their former gang in the Cincinnati, Ohio area. The Bureau of Prisons identified a fellow named Dennis Crombie who was serving time in Lompoc, a federal prisoner in prison in California, who had been arrested for smuggling drugs into the country by airplane. They and the FBI arranged for me to be transferred using his name. It was a fake transfer with fake paperwork, to be transferred to FCI Oxford under the guise that I was about to be released. I was there 3 days, 3 nights, and met with the 3 potential escapees. They talked about the plan. They even had one of them's girlfriend come in from Covington, Kentucky, which is right across the river from Cincinnati. And I met with her and a couple of the inmates in the visitors lounge. After my release, she and I met in a restaurant parking lot, and she gave me $5,000 in cash, disguises or clothing so that prisoners could change and not be obvious, two-way radios, the whole prison plan, told me where the stolen car would be after we flew out. And, she went back to Kentucky and I went home. She was charged. A couple of the other guys involved in the escape on the outside were charged. The three inmates all had time tacked on to their existing time and were sent to a maximum security prison in Marion, Illinois. It sounds dangerous, but it really wasn't. Everything was controlled and there was no danger involved. I was under closed circuit TV the whole time and it was sort of a fun experience, but no danger there. The one that I mentioned about Wounded Knee had a little element of danger, only in the sense that no one had a backup plan. Like if the Indians found out I wasn't an electrician, who knows what might have happened.
Goodness it didn't. How about the use of informants? Can you comment on the use of informants to help solve cases in general and how you personally used them?
Well, in the FBI, informants are a big thing. You're rated on them as an agent. That's part of your performance rating. They're probably the most difficult thing that an agent encounters because you're dealing with criminals. The only people that know anything about what you're after will be people on the inside. If you're on the outside, you're a whistleblower. That's not the same thing as an informant. An informant is someone that has details about a criminal or security enterprise. They're usually killers, robbers, prostitutes, people that live the life, as they call it, on the street. None of them are the type of person you'd invite home to dinner to meet your parents or that type of thing. I'll give you one example. In 1974, there was a bank robbery in West Dallas, a suburb of Milwaukee. Four men went into the bank, fired off some shots into the ceiling, choked the bank manager with a phone cord, terrorized the customers and employees, robbed the bank and left. They had obviously failed bank robbery planning 101 because before going into the bank, they had parked their car in a resident's driveway, which irritated that resident to the point that he went out and copied the license plate number down. We found that during our neighborhood investigation. We were able to trace it back to a car rental place in Chicago, and from there identify the four robbers. One of the robbers was a fellow by the name of Johnny Flournoy. And I should have mentioned earlier, one of the motivations for becoming an informant is looking to get a good deal legally. Informants are always motivated by self-serving methods. Money, revenge, getting the legal benefit of a court action. In this case, Johnny decided that he wanted some legal assistance. And you always do things on a quid pro quo basis. In other words, if I'm going to recommend that they go easy on you when you come up for sentencing, you've got to give me something important. Johnny gave me something important. It was a good trade. He told me about a bank robbery and murder in Elkville, Illinois. A gang out of East St. Louis, Illinois, had robbed a bank there. They had carjacked a vehicle belonging to a lady named Colleen Battaglia. She was a wife of a Southern Illinois professor. After the robbery, they raped her, shot her, left her in the trunk of her car, set it on fire in a remote location. Johnny, my informant, knew about it. He was part of the original plan, but he had unfortunately been arrested on another charge and was in jail when they did it. He told me that the robbery had been planned, but the murder had been unplanned. It was just one of those spontaneous acts of deviancy, if you want to look at it that way. We were able to arrest all 4 of the people involved. I testified in their case. Johnny testified. I was actually a defense witness. I was called to testify that he got a good deal as part of their case.
Yep.
They ended up getting 230 years each, life without parole. Interestingly, one of the 4 guys was killed by the others because they knew there was an informant. They just didn't know it was Johnny. So one of the 4, named Robert Fisher, they killed him before the trial.
Wow.
An interesting epilogue to that is after I had retired from the FBI and came back to Virginia and was working for AIG, I'd barely gotten here, and I got a call from the state's attorney in Chicago. Johnny had been arrested again for capital murder and robbery, and they wanted me to testify in the death penalty phase of his sentencing. I was subpoenaed and went out and testified about his life of crime, which is like a resume, a pretty lengthy resume in his case. And he ended up not getting the death penalty, but he's in a maximum security prison, I think in Menard, Illinois now. Informants are tough. You know, you're stuck with them, and they can go either way on you. You've seen many movies or episodes on TV where the guy gets in too deep with an informant, or the informant turns on him, or things go bad. So it's not an easy gig.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with the Appropriations Committee, the U.S. House of Representatives, how that came about, what you did?
Well, as I mentioned, in 1982, an opportunity came up where the House Appropriations Committee in Washington was looking for an investigator. I applied for it and was accepted. I spent 4 years there working primarily military aviation and intelligence programs. I was based out of the Pentagon. The program involved, or the assignment involved, a lot of travel, both foreign and domestic. We worked with other agencies. After a year or so, was made team leader, and my team would consist of people from the CIA, the Department of Defense, the General Accounting Office, which was the most helpful of all because those were the number cruncher guys. And we would travel around to wherever there were high dollar appropriations that needed to be reviewed for feasibility or that type of thing. It was an interesting assignment, and I really enjoyed it and learned a lot about government. And it's a civics class from the inside looking out, and you see it warts and all.
Great. Later in your career, you spent 7 years in management rather than as an investigator. What do those duties entail?
Well, when I went to the House Appropriations Committee, I was promoted from a senior agent to a supervisory agent, a title I carried forward. From there, I went to headquarters where I was an inspector for 2 years, and my last 5 years were spent in Wisconsin, as I mentioned, a supervisory agent for the Western District. In that last position, I didn't do any investigative work. I had a group of agents that did the work and reported to me, and I reported up the line to a boss in Milwaukee. We covered a lot of ground. We had a number of interesting cases. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the cases we had some experience with. He was a serial killer and cannibal that probably people remember from back in that time period, the late 80s, early 90s. I had a case, or one of my agents had a case that was called in the media the Border Bandit. It was a woman who was a employee of the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office and a law school student. Hennepin County encompasses Minneapolis, St. Paul. She was robbing a series of banks up and down the Wisconsin and Minnesota border to pay for student loans and her gambling habit. Wow. I was interviewed by Connie Chung, who had a program called Eye to Eye, I believe, back, this was about 1993, and I was interviewed about this case by Connie Chung. Another case involved a fellow by the name of Virgil Lee, who was a chief pharmacist at the Mayo Clinic. He was the head of a group of pharmacists, drugstores, pharmacy salesmen who were diverting drug samples to their own use for cash purposes, which is in violation of the federal law. And we were able to convict a number of them. It was a lot going on, but most of it under the radar that you rarely hear about because it happens every day and there's always some other news item that takes precedent. It gets written up, though, in trade journals and the local papers, so a lot of it's still out there online.
Sometimes it's breaking news on the national news as well. Nothing else is breaking. After you retired from the FBI in 1994, you went to work for AIG, insurance giant. Tell us a little about the company and what your job was.
Well, people here, certainly people that follow the stock market, remember AIG. It was identified as a company too big to fail back during the recession of 2008, 2009. I went to work for them in 1994, managing insurance claims and fraud investigations. We had a staff of investigators, maybe 200. They're located in 13 regional offices across the country. It was, quite frankly, a difficult transition for me coming from the FBI. First of all, I didn't know squat about insurance. Moreover, when you're in the FBI, you have sort of this exalted feeling like you're different or maybe more important than other investigative entities. And I certainly came with that attitude, I'm sure. One of my first cases that brought that home to me was a case involving the human cannonball. One of AIG's insured was Feld Entertainment. As the name implies, they insured a whole bunch of entertainment entities, one of which was the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. About the time I retired, the circus was in Hartford, Connecticut. The human cannonball, a fellow named James Halliday, was fairly new to the position, and they probably loaded him up with too much gunpowder or whatever they used to propel him, and he overshot the net and caused damage to his knees and back. It was what we call a compensable injury. We had the workers' compensation line for Barnum and Bailey Circus. So after his injury, he was from California. He went home to recover, but after a while, he stopped going to physical therapy and stopped contacting the adjuster, and we were tasked with the job of finding out what was going on. I had an insurance vendor in California take a look. We did a background check. To make a long story short, we found that he was trying out for the Sacramento Kings professional basketball team. We were able to videotape him in the Kings costume jumping off of a trampoline and dunking a basketball. So we had great video. AIG, of course, denied the claim immediately, and it went to mediation. The Workers' Compensation Commission heard arguments on both sides, and I want to read you his attorney's argument. Halliday's lawyer argued, one, Ringling Brother Barnum and Bailey had no documented human cannonball job description. Number two, there was no specialized back-to-work rehabilitation available due to the limited number of medical specialists who knew anything about this job requirement. And number three, confined spaces now made Mr. Halliday claustrophobic. The in-house joke, which was not part of the decision, was that AIG lost the case because the circus couldn't find another human cannonball of the same caliber. I know it's a lame joke, but as I mentioned, it was a difficult transition. My friends made fun of me. My professional friends and some of my personal friends made fun of me and called me secret insurance man. So it shows you that perception is often reality.
Should we go to questions? Would you like to
If
recap?
now's the time, I'm happy with it.
Okay, well, we do have a few questions for you. The first one that came in is regarding the case that you told us about with the gentleman that was chained to the tree and his wife was abducted.
Yes.
The question is, how was he? How was the husband? Did he make out okay? And
I never found out beyond the fact that they stayed married because they were married when he passed away, but I never found out any private conversation, obviously, that may have existed between them. I'm sure he was probably sympathetic to her situation. I mean, I can't help but think that that would be a natural response. It was just both parties were placed in such a difficult position.
okay, well, thank you for that. Another question that came in was, were you ever worried about Susie's well-being during any of your stint with the FBI or anything that you were doing undercover?
Well, I should say that Susie is a very independent woman. We were married 31 years ago. She was in Washington and moved to Wisconsin to be with me. She had a really good job as an executive for a large Washington area building company. When she got to Madison, she had to make her life of her own because I was gone so much of the time. She did that magnificently. She went back to school. She got her master's degree from University of Wisconsin in Madison. She worked for the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation at Spring Green, which is located about 30 miles west. When we came to Virginia, she went back to school again, got her PhD at VCU, authored a couple of highly regarded books that are based on local architects. They're nationally recognized. She had her own architectural history and decorative arts consulting company here in Richmond, and she's been my partner throughout the entire process. She is my go-to person when I need advice, and I look forward to that continuing here at Westminster Canterbury.
Oh, well, that's just lovely. I know she says the same about you, but that's
I hope she's watching.
Hey, yeah, I'm sure she is. We can get her the YouTube link if not, but I'm pretty sure she is. So one other question that came in was, what is your level of security clearance?
I had what is known, all FBI agents have a top secret clearance. I had, and many also have what's called an SCI clearance, a secret compartmented information clearance, which is above and beyond the top secret level. It gives you access into certain, excuse me, into certain areas that are narrowly focused. You have to have a need to know, and you have to be able to document the need to know. You have to go through a more stringent background investigation, and it has to be renewed periodically. About every 2 years it has to be renewed. They do another background check every couple of years on you to make sure you're not involved with a spy or an inappropriate person.
And so that's a security clearance that you keep up currently?
Once you leave, unless you're going to go back and work in some position that requires a clearance, you lose it.
Okay.
I don't have any clearance at the moment,
Okay.
and haven't since I retired.
Thank you. And one other question, with all of the cases that you worked in the FBI, is there one specific one that you would consider life-changing?
I don't know that it would consider any of them life-changing. There's one that was interesting, and it has been unsolved. It was the hijacking of Northwest Flight back in 1971, around Thanksgiving time, 1971. It was known as a D.B. Cooper case, and it was unsolved. The individual that hijacked the plane parachuted out with $200,000 of Northwest Orient's money, parachuted out between Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. He's never been identified or found. He is not known if he's dead or alive. Some of the money washed up on a riverbank outside of Portland a number of years ago after the hijacking, and it was thought that maybe he's perished, but no one knows. The interesting part to that is I worked on that case. I was a regional coordinator for that case in the Midwest, assigning leads and handling certain leads myself. But years ago, Susie and I were in London. She's a museum person, I'm not. I did some research on Jack the Ripper, and I was struck by the similarities between D.B. Cooper and Jack the Ripper. And if I can read briefly the similarities, it might be of interest. I've got so many things here I'm working through. Yeah. D.B. Cooper is considered, that case is considered one of the three most significant missing persons cases in United States history. The other two are Jimmy Hoffa and Amelia Earhart. Both of those are, the identities are known. Cooper's the only one that's not known, and his name actually on the manifest was Dan Cooper. The D.B. Cooper somehow got picked up by the media erroneously, and that's how the case has been referred to ever since. But the similarities between Jack the Ripper and D.B. Cooper are, unlike Amelia Earhart and Jimmy Hoffa, the identities of both Cooper and Jack the Ripper are unknown. Both subjects operated alone with no known planning or operational assistance. No photographs, only artist conception drawings of each exist. Numerous suspects have been developed in both instances. None have proved conclusive. Law enforcement officials investigating each case cannot agree on any one primary suspect. Experts in both matters cannot agree on significant details regarding the individual's modus operandi, MO. For example, whether or not Jack the Ripper had formal medical experience, or whether or not D.B. Cooper had military or civilian parachute experience. Both subjects have spawned a number of books, movies, and tabloid conspiracies. Both subjects and their crimes have been the focus of criminal justice research, as well as a number of empirical studies conducted with other academic disciplines. None of those have shed much light in terms of case resolution. Both subjects remain cultural icons. And finally, both subjects continue to be social media stars with large fan bases. So it was one of those things where you think about cases that you've worked or researched. Both of these, obviously I didn't have any success bringing them to a resolution, but it's an interesting intellectual exercise.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I remember you telling me that you had researched that, so it's interesting to hear. And we had one last question come in, and it is, did you ever feel threatened in your work?
You know, it sounds boastful, and maybe is, but I never did. I mean, obviously in Vietnam, flying helicopters, it was always a certain level of threat if you want to look at it that way. I always felt like the good Lord had his thumb on me and I was going to come out of it okay. The FBI never worried about it a minute. With AIG, there was never, I was never even in a threatening situation there. So it was just an opportunity to live a bunch of adventures, and I've been blessed to have been able to do things that I really wanted to do.
Well, I'm so glad it was that way for you, and I'm sure your confidence helped Susie also when you were away from her, so she knew things were being taken care of the way they should. So this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. We really appreciate learning all about your history and your experiences, and I'm sure more questions will come about. I'm sure you'll be receiving phone calls or getting stopped in the hall for more questions, but this has been wonderful, and we certainly appreciate your time. And Bob, I don't know if you have any last words? Or
I just want to thank Jack for being so cooperative and for all the hard work he's put into this and all the hard work he's put in throughout his career. And to tell you a little bit about what's going to happen in January on Who Knew.
yes,
Can I do that?
please.
Our next Who Knew will be on Wednesday, January 20th, 2021 at 3 p.m. on TV 970. Our guest will be Dr. Sam Fuller, a plastic surgeon who for 25 years has participated in Operation Smile. Operation Smile is a nonprofit organization that works in developing nations around the world performing corrective surgeries on children with cleft lips and palates. Sam's humanitarian work has taken them to 20 countries in Eastern Europe, South and Southeast Asia, South America, the Middle East, and Africa. So please join us on January the 20th.
It's wonderful. Well, we'll look forward to that. But thank you both. This has been a fun and informative afternoon, and we
Thank
appreciate
you for
it.
having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.